The morning Andrew Wilcox rode out of the Wilcox Ranch toward the town of Caldwell, Kansas. His three brothers stood on the porch and watched him go with the kind of knowing looks that men wear when they are entirely certain they understand something they haven't yet been told. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas plains were just beginning to shake off the gray grip of winter, patches of green pushing through the brown earth like quiet promises. The sky stretched wide and pale blue overhead, the kind of sky that made a man feel both very small and strangely hopeful at the same time. Andrew sat tall in the saddle on his chestnut gelding buck, his hat pulled low against the morning breeze, his list of supplies folded neatly in his breast pocket. Flour, salt, nails, lamp oil. That was what the list said. That was the whole and honest purpose of the trip. His oldest brother, Daniel, leaned against the porch railing and crossed his arms. He was 34 and built like the land itself, broad and patient. He said nothing, just watched. Thomas, who was 29 and had the nervous energy of a man who could not stand still for longer than 30 seconds, chewed on a piece of dried grass and tipped his head to the side. Figure he'll be back by supper. He asked nobody in particular. Henry, the youngest of the three at 26, grinned wide enough to show the gap between his front teeth. "I figure he'll be back when he's back," he said, "and I figure whatever he brings home won't fit in the saddlebag." Daniel said nothing. He just watched the figure of Andrew grow smaller against the wide open plain until he disappeared into the shimmer of the horizon, and then he turned and walked back inside, because there was work to be done regardless of what his brother did in town. Andrew himself was not thinking about marriage. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, and quietly self-sufficient in the way that men who have worked the land their whole lives tend to become. He had grown up on that ranch with his father and his brothers after their mother passed from fever when Andrew was 11 years old. He had learned to cook and to mend and to make do, and somewhere along the way the years had simply passed without him paying them particular attention. He wasn't lonely exactly. Loneliness, as Andrew understood it, was for men who didn't have things to do, and Andrew always had things to do. But there were mornings when the silence of the house felt less like peace and more like absence, and he hadn't quite found a word for that particular feeling, so he had left it unnamed and untended, the way you leave a fence post that isn't broken yet but is beginning to lean. The ride to Caldwell was about 2 hours on a good day, through flat open country where the wind came in long steady waves across the grass, and the occasional hawk hung suspended in the air overhead like a thought someone had forgotten to finish. Andrew rode easy, letting Buck set his own pace, and he watched the land roll past with the comfortable familiarity of a man who has memorized every inch of a place without ever quite deciding to. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town in the truest sense, sitting right at the edge of the Kishom Trail, where the Longhorns came up from Texas heading north to the railroad. It was a town built for movement and transaction, for men passing through with money in their pockets and dust on their boots. There were a handful of saloons, a general store, a livery stable, a small church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, a hotel that had seen better years, and a handful of businesses that had sprung up to serve the steady flow of commerce that the cattle trade brought with it. Andrew rode in along the main street, which was still muddy from the spring rains, and tied Buck to the post in front of Hargrove's general store. He was reaching into his coat for the list when he heard the raised voice coming from across the street. It was not an unusual thing to hear raised voices in Caldwell. The town had a particular talent for noise, especially when the cattle drives were passing through. But something about this particular voice caught his attention in a way he couldn't immediately explain. It was a woman's voice, clear and sharp and entirely without fear, which was the surprising part. He turned and looked. Across the muddy street in front of the hotel, a woman was standing on the wooden sidewalk with her back absolutely straight and her chin lifted at an angle that communicated her complete refusal to be moved. She was facing a man Andrew recognized as Dale Fitch, who was red-faced and heavyset, and had a reputation for buying things he hadn't actually paid for yet. Between them, there appeared to be a disagreement in progress. Andrew could not hear every word over the ambient noise of the street, but the shape of the argument was clear enough. The woman had something Fitch wanted, or she was standing in a place Fitch wanted her to move from, and Fitch was using the considerable weight of his size and his loud voice to communicate his opinion, and the woman was communicating her own opinion with equal conviction despite being substantially smaller. Andrew took one more look at the situation and then crossed the street. He told himself it was simply the right thing to do. He told himself he would have done it for anyone. He told himself it had nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that the woman had the most strikingly direct green eyes he had ever seen in his life, which he noticed because he was now close enough to see them, and they were currently focused on Dale Fitch with an expression of absolute unimpressed patience that Andrew found remarkable. "I have told you twice already," the woman was saying, her voice level and precise, "that my father's bill is not my bill. He borrowed money from you, Mr. Fitch. I did not. I have no legal obligation to honor a debt I did not incur, and furthermore I have no money to give you even if I did, so I would appreciate it very much if you would step back and allow me to collect my luggage." Fitch stepped forward instead. "Your daddy skipped town owing me $60 and you're all he left behind, so as far as I'm concerned—" "As far as you're concerned," Andrew said, arriving at the sidewalk and settling his voice into the particular calm register that tended to make men pay attention, "this conversation is over." Fitch turned. He was a big man, but Andrew was not a small one, and Andrew had in addition the quiet, steady quality of a person who has decided something and does not intend to be persuaded otherwise. They looked at each other for a moment, long enough for the situation to clarify itself. Fitch looked back at the woman. He looked at Andrew again. He made a sound that was not quite a word and was not quite an insult and was not quite an acceptance, but contained elements of all three, and then he turned and walked back toward the saloon, which was where he had likely come from to begin with. Andrew turned to the woman. She was looking at him with those green eyes, and the expression in them had shifted from the one she had aimed at Fitch. This one was more measured, evaluating. "Thank you," she said. The words were gracious but not breathless. She was not a woman who felt saved. She was a woman who had simply been assisted in something she had been handling herself. He would have backed down on his own eventually, Andrew said, because it was true and because he suspected she would appreciate the acknowledgement. The corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. He would have, she agreed. But this was faster. Her name, as he learned over the next several minutes, was Caroline Monroe. She was 24 years old, recently arrived in Caldwell from Wichita, and she was in the particular situation that Andrew had roughly gathered from the argument, which was that her father had run a small hotel operation in Wichita, had borrowed money from various parties including Dale Fitch, had subsequently decided that Kansas was not the state for him any longer, and had departed without providing for his daughter's situation in any meaningful way. Caroline told him all of this with a directness and a lack of self-pity that Andrew found striking. She was not asking for sympathy. She was simply explaining the facts, because facts were what you worked with when you were figuring out what to do next. "So you're in Caldwell because he left from here?" Andrew asked. "I'm in Caldwell because I followed him here and arrived 2 days after he had already gone," Caroline said. "I have the contents of one trunk, $12, and a skill set that includes bookkeeping, cooking, and a reasonable ability to manage difficult men, as you may have observed." She said it perfectly straight, without vanity or complaint, and Andrew made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh before it became a smile. They were still standing on the sidewalk outside the hotel. The morning was moving around them, horses and wagons and the occasional cluster of cowboys, but Andrew found that he was in no particular hurry to go do the thing he had come to Caldwell to do. "Have you eaten this morning?" he asked. She considered him for a moment. "I had coffee," she said. "The hotel charges for breakfast separately and I decided it was an extravagance." "Come and have breakfast," Andrew said. "There's a decent place 2 doors down. I'll tell you what I know about Caldwell, which is more than what the hotel can tell you, and you can tell me whether you've decided what you're doing next." She looked at him for another moment, with that measuring quality in her eyes, and then she nodded once, like a woman making a decision she has already thought through and found reasonable. They ate at a small table in the back of a place, run by a woman named Martha Hobbs, who made biscuits that were one of the legitimate glories of the Kansas plains and coffee that was thick and dark, and as honest as the earth. Caroline ate without embarrassment or affectation, which Andrew noticed, because he had been around people who performed their hunger as something to be apologized for and found it tiresome. They talked for over an hour. This was not something Andrew had planned. He had a list of supplies and a set of tasks, and a general understanding of how long the day was supposed to take. But the conversation had a quality of ease and engagement that made time move differently, and he kept finding that he had more to say than he'd expected. Caroline was intelligent in the practical way that comes from necessity rather than education, though she had clearly had some of both. She had strong opinions about things like how a kitchen should be organized, and what made a town viable versus temporary, and whether the cattle trade was going to sustain Caldwell long-term or burn it out. She had been observing the town for 3 days with the careful eye of someone who needed to make decisions based on what she saw, and her observations were sharp and accurate. She had been briefly engaged to a man in Wichita. She mentioned this without drama, the way you mention weather. He had broken the engagement when her father's financial situation had become clear, which told her something about the man that she was glad to know before the ceremony rather than after. "Smart," Andrew said. "It was infuriating at the time," Caroline said, "but yes, in retrospect, smart." She asked him about himself with the same direct quality she brought to everything else, and Andrew found himself answering in more detail than he usually would. He told her about the ranch, about his brothers, about the particular rhythm of ranching life in Kansas in the 1870s. He told her about his father, who had died 3 years ago and left the 4 of them the land and the cattle and the responsibility of each other. "You run it together?" she asked. "More or less," Andrew said. "Daniel makes most of the big decisions, and none of the rest of us argue much because he's usually right. Thomas handles the horses, which is where his talent is. Henry does the accounts, which is where his talent is. I do a little of everything, which suits me." "What's your talent?" Caroline asked. Andrew thought about it honestly. "Staying calm when things go sideways," he said finally, "and knowing when something needs attention before it becomes a problem." She looked at him with those green eyes and nodded slowly, like she was filing that away. When they finished breakfast, and the moment came to step back out into the street, Andrew felt the particular awkwardness of a situation that had developed further than he had planned for, and now required some kind of acknowledgement or navigation. He stood on the sidewalk with Caroline Monroe and looked at the town around them and thought about his supply list. "Where are you going to stay?" he asked. "I have 2 more nights paid at the hotel," she said. "After that I need to find work. Mrs. Hobbs told me the mercantile might need help with their accounts. I'm going to speak with them this afternoon. And if they don't need help, then I'll find something else," Caroline said simply. "I'm not without options." He believed her. She had the quality of a person who manufactured options where none existed, which was an unusual and valuable thing. He went and bought his supplies. He loaded them onto Buck's saddlebags and the small pack horse he had brought for the heavier items. He did his whole list, efficient and thorough, the way he always did things. And then he stood by the horses and thought about Caroline Monroe sitting in her hotel room working out the arithmetic of $12 and 2 nights of shelter. And he thought about the ranch house that had 4 bedrooms and 3 of them used, and the 4th one standing empty. And he thought about the particular feeling of mornings in the silence of a house that was full of work but not full of much else. He was not a man who made decisions impulsively. He was a man who, when he had gathered enough information, moved with considerable conviction. And he felt, standing there by his horses in the muddy street of Caldwell, Kansas, with the spring sun climbing the sky and the smell of horses and mud and distant smoke all around him, that he had gathered a particular kind of information that morning and that it pointed in a particular direction. He went back to the hotel. Caroline was coming down the stairs when he came through the door, her coat on, a notebook in her hand, clearly on her way to the mercantile. She stopped when she saw him, and her expression asked a question without her saying any words. Andrew took his hat off, which was something he did when he was about to say something that required full sincerity. He held it in front of him, and he looked at her steadily, and he said what he had come back to say. "I know we've known each other for a morning," he said, "and I know that's not a long time, and I know this is an unusual thing to say at the end of a morning, but I would like to ask you to consider marrying me." The silence that followed was not a shocked silence or an offended one. It was a thinking silence, which was entirely consistent with everything Andrew had observed about Caroline Munro in the past several hours. "Tell me why," she said. He appreciated the question enormously. He could have done without a dozen other responses, but that one he appreciated. "Because you're the most sensible and direct person I've met in recent memory," he said. "Because you don't perform distress but you handle it instead. Because you made me laugh this morning, which doesn't happen as often as it should. Because I have a ranch and a house and a life that has good bones but needs someone in it who is genuinely present, and I think you might be that person. And because your situation is not comfortable, and I can offer you something better than $12 and 2 nights in a hotel." He paused. "That last part is not meant as charity," he added. "It's meant as honesty about the practical side of the thing, but the first parts are more important." Caroline Munro looked at him from the third step of the hotel staircase, her coat buttoned neatly, her notebook in her hand, her green eyes working through what he had said with the same careful quality she brought to everything. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me them." "I won't be a housekeeper who happens to wear a ring," she said. "If I marry you, I am your equal in the running of the house and in conversations about the ranch. Not a partner in the business necessarily, but a partner in the decisions that affect our life together. If you want someone to cook and clean and be quiet, I am not that person." "Good," Andrew said, "because I can cook and clean adequately myself, and quiet makes me uncomfortable after a while." The corner of her mouth moved again. "Second condition," she said. "If it doesn't work, if we try this and find we've made a mistake, I want to know that I can say so and be treated with honesty rather than resentment." "I'll give you the same promise," Andrew said. She came down the last 3 stairs. She was almost as tall as his shoulder, which meant she had to tilt her head back only slightly to look at him directly, and she did look at him directly for a long measuring moment. "All right," she said. "Yes." He put his hat back on, and something settled in him that he hadn't known was unsettled. The practical business of getting married in Caldwell, Kansas in 1878 was not a lengthy one. There was a circuit preacher named Reverend Elias Connolly who happened to be in town that very week, staying at the same hotel where Caroline had her room, and when they explained their intention to Mrs. Hobbs at the breakfast place, who knew everyone and everything in Caldwell, she went and fetched him herself with the brisk efficiency of a woman who approved of things being done properly and promptly. Reverend Connolly was a lean, weathered man of about 60 with kind eyes, and a voice that had been shaped by years of outdoor sermons and Kansas wind. He asked them a few questions with the quiet seriousness of a man who took his work seriously, and when he was satisfied that they knew what they were doing, which took him perhaps 15 minutes because Caroline answered every question so directly and thoughtfully that he seemed genuinely charmed, he agreed to perform the ceremony. They were married that afternoon in the small church on the edge of town, with Mrs. Hobbs and her husband as witnesses, and the afternoon light coming through the plain glass windows at a long golden angle that made the whole plain interior look warmer and older and more significant than it was. Caroline wore the better of her 2 dresses, which was a deep blue that suited her green eyes considerably. And Andrew had his hat off and his coat brushed and stood beside her with the calm steadiness that was his fundamental nature. When Reverend Connolly said the words, Andrew repeated them with simple sincerity, not making a performance of it but meaning every syllable in the exact plain way that he meant things. Caroline's voice was clear and steady, and she looked at him when she said her vows, which he noticed and which seemed important. When it was done, and Reverend Connolly had signed the paper and Mrs. Hobbs had cried very slightly in a way she seemed both helpless about and mildly annoyed by, they walked out of the church into the late afternoon light of a Kansas spring day, and Andrew thought that the world looked essentially the same as it had that morning, but with something fundamentally different about the quality of it. They collected Caroline's trunk from the hotel. It was heavy because it contained her books, which she had warned him about. He loaded it onto the pack horse with the supplies without complaint, and he was aware that the resulting load was a precise metaphor for how the day had gone, which was that he had arrived for one thing and was leaving with considerably more. The ride back to the Wilcox ranch took them through the long golden hour of late afternoon, when the plains turned amber, and the shadows grew long, and the wind settled into the gentle evening version of itself that felt like the land exhaling after the work of the day. They rode side by side, Andrew on Buck and Caroline on Dally, a calm bay mare he had brought for this purpose, except that he had brought Dally simply out of habit because he usually took a second horse to help carry things back, not because he had anticipated this specific outcome. They talked as they rode, the easy and continuous kind of conversation that flows between people who have found an unexpected frequency match. Caroline asked about the brothers, and Andrew described them honestly, including their particular qualities and their particular irritating habits, which she listened to with great interest. "How do you think they'll take this?" she asked at one point. Andrew considered it. "Henry will be delighted," he said. "Thomas will be stunned but recover quickly. Daniel will be quiet about it and then ask you 3 very direct questions, and if you answer them honestly, he'll be fine." "What kind of questions?" "Probably about whether you know what you're getting into and whether you're capable of the life. He's protective of the ranch and of us. He means well by it even when it's mildly irritating." "I can answer those honestly," Caroline said. "I know you can," Andrew said. The ranch came into view as the sun was touching the horizon, a cluster of buildings in the flat landscape that had the solid, purposeful look of things that had been built to last rather than to impress. The main house was a 2-story frame structure, sturdy and functional, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and the south side. There were 2 large barns, a bunkhouse for the hired hands, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and a kitchen garden that had been established years ago and still produced with annual faithfulness. 3 figures were on the porch as Andrew and Caroline rode up the long drive. He could see them even at a distance, because 3 grown men standing still on a porch they are ordinarily moving around on is a thing that stands out. They had seen the 2 riders coming from a distance, across the flat plain, and they had had time to observe that one of the riders was not a person they recognized, and that the unknown person appeared to be a woman. This gave the brothers a preparatory window that they had used wisely, which meant they were standing in an arrangement of studied casualness that fooled no one. Andrew brought Buck to a stop in front of the porch steps and looked at his brothers. Henry was grinning. Thomas was doing something with his expression that suggested he was physically preventing it from doing what it wanted to do, which was probably also grinning. Daniel had his arms crossed, and his expression was the one he used when he was reserving judgment without prejudging. "I got the supplies," Andrew said. "I see that," Daniel said. There was a pause. "This is Caroline," Andrew said. "She's my wife." Henry made a sound that was half laugh and half something else that didn't have a word. Thomas's expression gave up and grinned. Daniel looked at Caroline for a long, steady moment. Caroline looked back at Daniel with the same calm steadiness she brought to everything. "How do you do?" she said. Her voice was polite and direct and entirely unintimidated. Daniel uncrossed his arms. "Well enough," he said. "You'd better come inside," which was Daniel's version of a welcome, and it was entirely adequate. The inside of the Wilcox house was what it was, which was a house run by four men who valued function over aesthetics but who were not without basic standards. It was clean in the way of things that are cleaned because cleanliness matters, but decorated only in the way of things that are useful. Caroline walked in and looked around with an observing eye that took in everything without commenting on it, which Andrew noticed with appreciation because comments could wait and observation was what mattered first. They put Caroline's trunk in the bedroom that would be theirs, which required some rearrangement of Andrew's existing belongings, which he conducted efficiently and without self-consciousness. Caroline helped, taking one side of the small dresser when it needed to be moved, not standing back and waiting to be accommodated. Henry appeared in the doorway about halfway through this process and leaned against the frame with his grinning face and said, "I like her already." "You don't know her yet," Andrew said. "She picked you, didn't she?" Henry said. "That shows good judgment." Caroline turned from the dresser and looked at Henry. "He picked me first," she said. "I had conditions." Henry's grin widened to its maximum extent. "Even better," he said. "Supper that night had a quality that was different from every supper before it, which was a particular energy of a new thing that is not yet settled but has every intention of settling well." Caroline insisted on helping with the cooking and took over the biscuits entirely once she had observed what Thomas was doing to them, which was insufficient on several counts. Thomas was not offended because the biscuits that came out of the oven were genuinely better than what he would have made, and Thomas was a practical man who valued outcome over process. Daniel asked his questions after supper, while Andrew and Henry were washing up and Thomas was feeding the horses. He did it the way Daniel did things, which was simply and directly, sitting across the table from Caroline with his coffee and his steady eyes. "You know what ranching life is," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I know something of it," Caroline said. "I know it's hard and I know it's constant and I know the margins are often narrow. I know there isn't much room for a person who isn't willing to work. And you're willing to work." "I've been working since I was 16, Caroline said. "My father was not a reliable provider and I filled the gaps. I'm not afraid of hard work." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "Andrew's a good man," he said. "He's the steadiest of us, which is saying something because we're a generally steady family. He deserved better than an empty house." "I didn't come here to give him a warm body in an empty house," Caroline said. "I came here because he asked me honestly, and I answered honestly, and I believe we're suited." Daniel picked up his coffee cup. "Then we're glad you're here," he said, and that was the whole of the matter as far as he was concerned. The first months of their marriage had the quality of two people constructing something together, both of them bringing different tools and different materials, and working out the architecture of a shared life with patience, and a great deal of conversation, and some occasional friction that was the productive kind, the kind that comes from two genuinely strong-willed people who are both trying to get the same thing right. Caroline took over the household accounts within the first week, because Henry, who handled the ranch accounts, was perfectly competent with numbers but found the domestic side of things tedious in a way that made him sloppy. She went through the household spending with a methodical eye and found 3 places where money was simply being wasted through habit and inattention, which she changed with minimal drama and visible result. She could ride, adequately if not brilliantly, and she went out with Andrew on the range on days when the weather was good, learning the land with the same systematic attention she brought to the accounts. She asked questions constantly, good questions, the kind that told you she had already thought about the thing before asking. Andrew found this a pleasure rather than an imposition, because he liked thinking about the land, and he liked even more having someone to think about it with. There was a morning in early June, about 6 weeks into the marriage, when they were riding the southern boundary of the ranch checking the fence line, and the morning was perfect in that specific Kansas way, where the sky is that particular clear blue and the grass is all the various greens of late spring, and the air has both warmth and freshness in equal measure. Caroline had gotten better on horseback in 6 weeks than some people got in a year, because she had the quality of paying close attention to what she was being taught. Andrew was showing her how to check a fence post for soundness, pressing it at the base with his boot and watching for ground movement that would indicate rot, and she was watching with her full attention, the way she watched everything, and he looked up and she was looking not at the fence post but at him, with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. It was something soft in those green eyes, something that hadn't been there in the measuring look she gave him on the hotel stairs. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was thinking that I made the right decision." It was a simple thing to say, and she said it simply, without making a romantic performance of it, and that quality of simplicity was what made it land with such particular weight in Andrew's chest. "I was thinking the same thing," he said, and they both looked back at the fence post, and the morning continued, and something between them had moved a step further into what it was becoming. The summer of 1878 was a working one, as all summers on the Kansas plains were. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed maintaining, the hay needed cutting and storing for winter, the garden needed watering and weeding and harvesting. The house needed the 1,000 small attentions that houses require. Andrew and his brothers worked from before sunrise to after sunset on most days, and Caroline worked alongside the rhythm of it, managing the house and the garden and the accounts, and on several occasions, riding out to help when an extra pair of hands was needed. There was a heat wave in July that killed 2 of their best steers and cracked the earth until it looked like the surface of something old and exhausted. And during the worst of it, the well ran low and they had to haul water from the creek, which was a slow and heavy business. Caroline hauled water without complaint, wearing a wide-brimmed hat Andrew had found for her in the barn and her sleeves rolled up, and she made cold coffee at the end of the long hot days and brought it out to the porch where they all sat in the last of the evening air and drank it, and nobody said much, but the quality of the quiet was good. On those porch evenings, Andrew sometimes watched Caroline without intending to watch her, the way you watch a fire because fire is interesting and alive. She would be looking out at the darkening plain with the coffee in her hand and her face still and thoughtful, and he found that what he felt about that was something considerably stronger than what he had felt 6 weeks or 8 weeks ago, something that had grown in the ordinary course of ordinary days and was now large enough to notice. He told her one evening. It was not a planned or ceremonial thing. They were in the bedroom they shared, the window open to the warm night air, and she was at the small desk she had set up for her accounts work, and he was sitting on the edge of the bed taking his boots off, and he simply said, "I love you, Caroline." She turned from the desk and looked at him. The lamp was on and it made the room warm and gold, and her face in that light was a thing he knew he would remember. "I've been thinking for about 2 weeks that I love you," she said. "I wasn't sure if it was too soon to say it." "Is there a right time?" Andrew asked. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't done this before, not for real." She paused. "I love you. It's a different kind of thing than I expected." "Different how?" Andrew asked. "I thought it would feel like excitement," she said. "And it does sometimes, but mostly it feels like being warm, like the house feels in winter when the fire is going and everything outside is cold. Like something you didn't know you needed until you had it." Andrew looked at her across the lamplit room and thought that she had described it exactly, and that he could not have improved on it in any way. He crossed the room and kissed her, gently but fully, with the kind of kiss that says, "I see you and I mean everything I said." And she kissed him back the same way, and the Kansas night was warm and wide outside the open window, and the stars were extraordinary in the way that only stars over flat, dark country can be. The autumn arrived with its customary bluntness, the way Kansas autumn does, moving from summer to cold in a matter of weeks without the gradual negotiation that more temperate climates allow. The ranch shifted into its fall preparations. the layering in of supplies and the shoring up of structures, and the various tasks that stand between a cattle operation and a Kansas winter. Caroline discovered in September that she was pregnant. She told Andrew on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, with the directness she brought to everything. And Andrew's face did something that he had no control over at all, which was to light up with a simple, uncomplicated happiness that he could not have manufactured if he'd tried. "Good," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand, and she laughed at the simplicity of his response, which made him laugh too, and they sat there in the Sunday morning kitchen with the light coming in and the coffee going cold and laughed together in the particular way of people who are genuinely happy. He told his brothers at supper, and Henry nearly knocked his chair over in his enthusiasm, and Thomas smiled the quiet, solid smile of a man who is genuinely glad, and Daniel looked at Caroline and said, "How are you feeling?" with real concern, and Caroline said she was feeling perfectly well and planned to continue feeling well, and Daniel nodded in the way that indicated he believed her. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a hard one, as Kansas winters had a tendency to be. The wind came down from the north with a particular mean persistence, driving snow against the house and piling it in drifts against the barn and the fence posts, until the landscape looked like something from another world entirely. The cattle had to be fed by hand from the stores they had laid in, trudging out through the cold twice a day to throw hay from the sledge, coming back into the house with frost on their mustaches, and their hands needing several minutes by the stove before they worked properly again. Caroline kept the house warm and fed, and in good order during the worst of it, which was a significant undertaking. She made soup in large quantities that lasted several days and bread every other day and pie when there were stored apples to make it from, and she kept the accounts and wrote letters to the few people she maintained correspondence with, and she knitted, which she had learned from a neighbor in Wichita and found meditative. She was magnificent with being pregnant in the specific way of people who have decided that pregnancy is a condition of their current life and not an exemption from it. She did not stop doing things. She simply did them with the appropriate adjustments, which she calculated independently and applied sensibly, and Andrew watched this with the mixture of admiration and concern that the combination of love and impending fatherhood produces. On the evenings of those long winter nights, they sat by the fire in the main room, sometimes with the brothers, sometimes alone, and Caroline read aloud to him sometimes, which was something he had not experienced since childhood and found he had missed without knowing it. She had a good reading voice, measured and expressive without being theatrical, and the sound of it in the fire-lit room while the wind went at the windows outside was one of the most pleasant things Andrew had experienced in his adult life. He told her that one night, and she looked at him over the book and said, "You should have more pleasant things in your life. You work too hard to have so few." "I have more now than I had," he said. "We're going to make sure you keep having more," she said, and turned back to the page, and the fire crackled, and the wind made its ongoing argument with the house, and Andrew felt the warmth she had described, the being warm kind of love, deep in the bones of him. The spring of 1879 came with its usual relief and the sense of emerging from something, the way spring in hard country always feels like survival rewarded. The world turned green again, and the cattle got onto the new grass, and the work shifted back into its warmer season rhythm, and everyone moved a little more freely and a little more hopefully. In March of that year, a situation developed in Caldwell that had implications for the Wilcox Ranch and for several other ranching operations in the area. A man named Garrett Poole had been buying up land in the county with what appeared to be a combination of legitimate money and a set of tactics that occupied the area between persuasion and intimidation. He had acquired 3 properties already, and there were rumors that he had designs on several more, including rangeland that various operations in the area depended on for grazing access. Andrew heard about this from a rancher named Will Sutton when he was in town for supplies, which was the legitimate kind of town trip, entirely successful on its original terms. He brought the information home and described it at supper, and the conversation among the brothers had the careful quality of men thinking through a problem they would rather not have. The concern was specific. There was a stretch of grazing land to the southeast that the Wilcox brothers had used by informal arrangement with its original owner, a retired rancher named Josiah Perkins, who had no use for it anymore and was glad for it to be used. That land was not deeded to the Wilcoxes, which meant that if Poole acquired it, the informal arrangement would end, and the impact on the ranch's summer grazing capacity would be significant. "Can Perkins sell?" Caroline asked from her end of the table. "He can sell to whoever he wants," Daniel said. "It's his land." "Has anyone spoken to him about what Poole's been doing with the properties he acquires?" There was a pause at the table. It was the kind of pause that indicates a thing that should have been done and wasn't. "I'll go see him," Andrew said. "I'll come with you," Caroline said. Andrew looked at her. She was 8 months pregnant, and it was March in Kansas, and Perkins' place was a 2-hour ride. "The buggy," Caroline said, anticipating the objection. "There's nothing wrong with me that a 2-hour buggy ride will hurt." He took her in the buggy the next day, and they spent an afternoon with Josiah Perkins, who was 71 years old and sharp and glad for the company. Caroline talked to him with the same direct and genuine quality she brought to everything, telling him honestly what was happening and why it mattered, not making it about charity but making it about fairness and the long-term picture of the community. Perkins listened. He was a man who had seen a great deal and could assess people with the efficiency that comes from long experience. He listened to Caroline in particular with a focused attention. At the end of the conversation, he said that he had no intention of selling to Garrett Poole under any circumstances, and furthermore that if the Wilcox brothers wanted to formalize the grazing arrangement with proper paperwork, he would be happy to do that, and he'd have his lawyer in Caldwell draw something up the following week. On the ride home, Andrew said, "You did that." "We did that," Caroline said. "You knew him. I just asked the right questions." "You knew which questions were the right ones," he said. She looked at him with those green eyes that had been direct and clear from the first morning he had seen them, and smiled. "So did you," she said. "You just weren't going to say them because you don't like asking for things for yourself. You needed someone along who doesn't have that problem." It was so accurate that he laughed, and she laughed too, and the buggy rolled through the spring landscape with the smell of new grass and wet earth all around them, and the sky impossibly wide. And Andrew thought that he had married not just a person he loved but a person who knew him, which was a different and rarer thing. The formal grazing arrangement was completed in April. Garrett Poole made one approach to Perkins through an intermediary and was politely and definitively declined. He turned his attention to other properties, and the immediate problem was resolved. On the 14th of April, 1879, Caroline went into labor. Andrew had been prepared for this in the theoretical way that practical information prepares you for things, which is to say he knew what was supposed to happen and what the general progression was. But the actual experience of watching someone you love go through something difficult while your own role is essentially supportive, rather than active, is a specific kind of difficult that no amount of practical information covers. He stayed close. He was not a man who paced or went outside to escape the anxiety of it, which he considered a form of cowardice. He was not going to permit himself. He stayed in the house and was useful where he could be, and stayed out of the way where he couldn't, and held her hand when she wanted it held and didn't when she needed both hands for other purposes. The doctor from Caldwell was there, a competent and unflappable man named Dr. Hart, who had been practicing in Kansas long enough to take most things in stride. Mrs. Hobbs had come out from town, because Caroline had become fond of her in the year since the wedding, and Mrs. Hobbs was experienced in these matters and had a calming effect on everyone in her vicinity. The labor was long, 13 hours, and there were stretches in the middle of it where it was hard and frightening in the way that childbirth in 1879 could be, with none of the reassurances that later times would provide, only the skill of the doctor and the patience of the process, and the particular fierceness with which Caroline Monroe Wilcox applied herself to things that were required of her. The baby was born at just past 2 in the morning, a boy, strong and loud, and thoroughly himself from the first breath. Andrew held him in the lamplight while Caroline rested, and the baby's face was the most extraordinary thing Andrew had ever seen, red and opinionated and entirely new, and he looked at his son and felt something seismic move through him, something that rearranged the whole interior landscape of what mattered. They named him James, after Andrew's father, who had been James Wilcox, and had built the ranch that his sons were now running and expanding. It was Caroline's suggestion, and when Andrew heard her say it, he had to look away for a moment at the lamp, and she didn't comment on that, just waited, which was one of the things he loved about her. Henry, informed at breakfast, celebrated so vigorously that he broke a coffee cup. Thomas went to the barn and came back with his eyes slightly red and very bright, and made an enormous breakfast that nobody could finish. Daniel went and sat with Caroline for a quarter of an hour by himself, and when he came out he clapped Andrew on the shoulder once, firmly, and went back to work, and Andrew understood the whole of what Daniel felt in that single grip. Little James was a vigorous and characterful baby, who expressed his opinions about the world loudly and consistently. He slept in the lengths of time that babies determine for themselves and woke when he determined, which meant that Andrew and Caroline navigated the first months on the fractured sleep that new parents navigate, doing so with the kind of cheerful solidarity that comes from genuinely liking the person you are sleep-deprived alongside. Andrew took his turns in the night without being asked to, because it seemed straightforwardly the right thing, and because he found the pre-dawn hours with the baby, the two of them in the lamplight while the house was dark and still, to be something particular that he would not have traded. He talked to James in those hours about the ranch, and about the land, and about whatever was on his mind, the way you talk to someone who cannot yet understand the words, but to whom the talking still matters. Caroline watched this with those green eyes and did not say much about it, but she looked at him with an expression that he had come to understand was her version of something very full. The summer of 1879 moved with the particular pace of a life that is very busy and very rich simultaneously. The ranch had a good year, the cattle prices were strong at the Caldwell markets, and the hay was excellent, and the new grazing arrangement with the formal papers gave them the security they had needed. Henry expanded the horse breeding operation he had been working toward, partnering with Thomas's talent with animals to produce a small but quality string of working horses that found ready buyers among the ranchers in the county. Caroline had her hands entirely full and managed them with the efficiency she brought to everything. James, as the months went on, developed into a round and active presence who wanted to be part of whatever was happening at all times, and was not shy about communicating this want. He had Andrew's steadiness of temperament but Caroline's eyes, and he looked at the world with those green eyes with an expression of thorough interest that made everyone who saw him laugh. There were challenges, because life on the Kansas plains did not allow very long without challenges. A stretch of dry weather threatened the south pasture in August and required careful management of the water they had. A price dispute with a Caldwell cattle buyer required Daniel to spend 2 days in town negotiating, which he did successfully, but grimly. A late-season storm in October blew a section of roof off the smaller barn, requiring 3 days of repair work in weather that was not cooperative. Through all of it, Andrew and Caroline moved as a unit with the ease of people who have come to understand each other's rhythms and capabilities thoroughly. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both people of strong view, but their disagreements had the quality of good faith negotiations between people who trust each other's intentions, even when they differ on the method. They resolved things by talking them through, neither of them comfortable with letting unaddressed things sit, and this kept the foundation sound. Daniel observed all of this with his quiet attentiveness, and one evening in late autumn, when the brothers were sitting on the porch after supper and the women and children sounds from inside the house were warm background to the cool evening air, he said to Andrew, "She's good for you." "I know," Andrew said. "She's good for all of us," Daniel said. "The house is different. Better." "I know that too," Andrew said. Daniel sat with his coffee for a moment. "You know, the day you left for Caldwell," he said, "Henry bet Thomas $2 you come back with a wife." Andrew looked at his brother. "Did he?" "Thomas bet against it," Daniel said. "Not because he thought you wouldn't do it eventually, but because he thought a single supply run was a short time." "He was right that it was a short time," Andrew said. "He was wrong about the outcome, though," Daniel said. "Henry was right." "Henry's right about me more often than I'd like to admit," Andrew said. Daniel smiled, which was not a frequent occurrence but was all the more pleasant for that. "He collected his $2 the day you rode in," he said. "I didn't mention it at the time because it seemed beside the point." Andrew laughed, genuinely, the kind that starts in your chest, and from inside the house came the sound of Caroline laughing at something, though neither of them could hear what, just the sound of it, clear and warm through the evening air. The following spring, 1880, brought with it the news that Garrett Poole had indeed encountered difficulties of the legal variety, a land scheme in the next county that had been less carefully constructed than his Kansas operations, and had attracted the attention of a federal land office inspector. The threat he had represented to the ranching community in the Caldwell area dissolved without requiring anyone to do anything directly about it, which was the most satisfying kind of problem resolution. Henry, who had developed a habit of being the person who brought news home from town, arrived back one afternoon with this information, and delivered it with great relish and the addition of various dramatic details that may or may not have been entirely accurate. Caroline listened to the account with a particular quality of satisfaction that she didn't bother to hide, because she had done a good piece of work in the matter of Josiah Perkins the year before, and she was entitled to her satisfaction, and everyone at the table knew it. James turned 1 year old in April of 1880 and celebrated this event by taking his first unassisted steps across the kitchen floor, moving with the determined and slightly surprised quality of someone who has discovered that a thing works and is very interested in continuing to make it work. He crossed the entire kitchen, roughly 12 feet, and arrived at the other side and sat down suddenly and looked up at the circle of faces watching him with an expression of complete self-congratulation. Andrew picked him up and held him up over his head, and James laughed with the whole force of his small body, and Caroline stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them both with that full expression she had, and Henry said from the table, "The boy's got your stubbornness, Andrew, walking before he was ready," and Caroline said, "He walked when he was ready, which was earlier than anyone expected because he was ready sooner," and Henry said, "Yes, that's what I meant," and even Daniel smiled. The summer of 1880 brought a development that had been in discussion for some time, which was the question of expanding the main house. 4 brothers had been able to manage comfortably enough before, but with James and with the possibility of more children as time went on, and with the general growth of the operation which brought with it occasional need to house visitors or hired hands overnight, the house had begun to feel its limits. Daniel proposed it formally at a family supper in June, laying out the practical and financial case in the precise way he brought to all business matters. The proposal was to add a room to the east side of the house, extending the ground floor, which would provide an additional bedroom and a larger working space that could serve as a study or an additional sitting room depending on the need. Caroline had thoughts, because Caroline always had thoughts, and she shared them in the direct way she shared everything, suggesting modifications to the plan that she had clearly thought through before the conversation, including a detail about a window placement that turned out to be the key to making the whole thing work better than Daniel's original version. Daniel listened to her suggestions with the same respectful attention he gave to anyone with a sound argument, which was the highest form of respect Daniel Wilcox knew how to offer. The construction happened through the summer, with the Wilcox brothers doing most of the work themselves with the help of 2 hired men who were skilled in frame construction, and it was completed before the first cold arrived in September, solid and well built, and clearly part of the original house rather than an afterthought. In the new room, Caroline set up the desk from the bedroom, which meant that she had a proper working space for the first time, and she arranged her books along the wall, and it was the kind of room that becomes immediately and exactly what it was meant to be, and she stood in the middle of it on the day it was finished and looked around with an expression that Andrew recognized as joy in its quieter form, the kind that doesn't need announcing. "Good?" he asked from the doorway. "Very good," she said. He looked at the room and at his wife standing in it, in the house they shared, on the land they worked, in the life they had built in 2 years from a morning in a muddy street. He thought about the supply list in his pocket that morning, flour and salt and nails and lamp oil, and how it was and was not the whole story of why he had gone to Caldwell. "You know what my brothers said?" he asked. "About the morning I left for town." She turned and looked at him with those green eyes. "They knew," he said, "apparently even before I did." She tilted her head slightly. "What did they know?" "Henry bet Thomas $2 I'd come home with a wife," Andrew said. "He won." Caroline looked at him for a moment, and then the smile came, the full one, not the corner of the mouth one she gave to things that were merely amusing, but the actual smile she gave to things that genuinely delighted her. "Nobody was surprised," she said. "Nobody was surprised," Andrew agreed. "Were you?" she asked. "Surprised when you went back to the hotel?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I don't think I was. I think I went to Caldwell for supplies and for you, even though I didn't know the second part until the first part was done." She crossed the room and she put her hands on either side of his face, which she did occasionally in moments of particular emphasis, and she looked at him with the directness that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her and the thing he would never stop noticing. "Andrew Wilcox," she said, "you are the most sensible thing that has ever happened to me." "That's not romantic," he said. "Yes, it is," she said. "It's exactly romantic." And she kissed him in the doorway of the new room, and James made a loud noise of comment from somewhere in the house, and outside the Kansas late summer afternoon was doing what it did, which was being enormous and golden and indifferent to time. Through the autumn and into the winter of 1880, the ranch settled into its rhythms, and the family within it settled into theirs. James was walking everywhere with tremendous conviction and beginning to produce words, not many and not always fully formed, but clearly intentional, little sound shapes that corresponded to things he saw and wanted. He called Andrew Duh and Caroline Ma, and he called Henry Hen, which Henry considered the finest nickname he had ever received, and he called the horses something that was approximately horse, and the dog something unprintable. Henry, who was 28 by now and had been observed by several people to spend an increasing amount of time in conversation with a young woman named Ruth Calloway, who helped her family run the feed store in Caldwell, came home one evening in November with the slightly dazed and overly casual quality of a man who has something significant to say and is not sure how to approach it. Caroline spotted this immediately at supper. She made no direct comment, but she caught Andrew's eye across the table and communicated something with those green eyes that required no words, and Andrew kept his expression entirely neutral and waited. After supper on the porch, Henry said to Andrew, "I've been thinking about talking to Mr. Calloway." "About what?" Andrew said. "About Ruth," Henry said. Andrew let a moment pass. "And have you talked to Ruth about this plan?" "She seems receptive," Henry said. "Seems receptive," Andrew said. Henry looked out at the dark plain. "She is," he said. "She told me, directly." "Then I'd say talk to Mr. Calloway," Andrew said. Henry turned and looked at him with an expression that contained both the residual traces of the gap-toothed grin and something more serious underneath it. "How did you know?" he asked. "With Caroline. How did you know it was the right thing?" Andrew thought about it. "It felt clear," he said. "Not exciting the way something reckless feels clear, but actually clear, like something that made sense in a way that other things don't quite." Henry was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that." He spoke to Mr. Calloway the following week. Ruth Calloway became Ruth Wilcox the following spring, in a proper ceremony at the Caldwell church, considerably better attended than Andrew and Caroline's wedding had been. And the two weddings became a kind of family story with their own particular character. Andrew and Caroline's with its spontaneity and its supply-run origin, and Henry and Ruth's with its deliberate courting and its 3 seasons of Sunday conversations at the feed store. Caroline and Ruth became friends with the ease of women who recognize each other as people of similar quality, which was another gift that Andrew thought about with gratitude. Ruth was gentler in manner than Caroline, but no less capable, and she had a talent for music that she brought to the house in the form of a small organ she had grown up playing, and the evenings had a new dimension after that, with music from the front room on nights when the work was done and everyone was gathered. The years settled into themselves. 19 years pass in the way of years that are full, not quickly exactly, but with a sense of substance, of actual content packed into the passing of each one. There were good years and harder years. The drought of 1881 that required everything they had learned about conservation and management. The excellent cattle prices of 1883 that allowed them to pay off the last of the land debt that their father had left. The brutal winter of 1886 to 1887 that was the hardest on the Kansas ranges in living memory, and cost them a significant portion of their cattle, and cost other operations far more. Through all of it, Andrew and Caroline. Through the hard times with the same clarity and practical intelligence they had always brought, Caroline managing the household economics with the precision that had saved them real money in a dozen situations, Andrew working the land with the steady hands and the calm head that were his essential qualities. Through the good times with a grateful appreciation that people who have known difficulty tend to bring to prosperity. In the spring of 1882, Caroline had their second child, a girl they named Eliza, after Caroline's mother, who had been a good woman who had died young, and who Caroline had loved genuinely and talked about with a quiet sadness that was never entirely absent when the subject came up. Eliza was born in the spring morning with considerably less drama than James's arrival, as if she had observed from wherever she was waiting that the thing was going to be done, and had decided to cooperate. She had Andrew's brown eyes and Caroline's precise mouth, and she was a person of strong and specific opinion from a very young age. James, who was 3 when she arrived, was initially uncertain about this development and expressed his uncertainty loudly, and then decided that she was interesting and acceptable and became her most devoted protector, which was a role he would occupy for the rest of his life. Andrew and James had a particular relationship that was one of the deep pleasures of Andrew's life. As James grew, from toddler to boy to the beginning of youth, Andrew taught him the things of the ranch with the same patient attention that his own father had taught him, and James learned with an eager seriousness that was both his mother and his father in it. He was not a child who took instruction easily from everyone, but he took it from Andrew with a focused gravity that made lessons move quickly. One afternoon when James was 6, they were mending a fence together, which was a task James was helping with in a genuine capacity for the first time, holding the post while Andrew drove the staples. James asked, in the middle of this work, "Pa, how did you know Mama was the one you wanted to marry?" Andrew drove another staple before he answered. "I talked to her for a morning," he said, "and at the end of the morning I knew." James considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old processing adult information. "That's not very long," he said. "No," Andrew agreed, "it isn't. But it worked out, James said. It worked out, Andrew said. James thought for another moment. Was Uncle Henry surprised? Andrew smiled. Uncle Henry bet your Uncle Thomas $2 that it would happen, he said. He was the least surprised person in the county. James thought about this for a long time. I'm going to ask Mama about it, he said finally with the air of someone filing a research plan. You should, Andrew said. She'll tell you what she thought that morning. It might be different from what I thought. What did you think? I thought she was the most direct and sensible person I'd ever met, Andrew said. And I thought the house was too quiet. James nodded slowly, as if this answered a question he'd had but hadn't known to ask. That evening James did ask Caroline, and she sat down at the kitchen table with him with the full attention she always gave to questions asked seriously by people who meant them seriously, regardless of their age. Your father came back to the hotel when I was leaving to look for work, she said. And I thought, this man took his hat off to ask me something serious. He was honest about what he was offering and honest about why. I had conditions and he didn't argue with them. He just agreed because they were reasonable. James thought about this. And you knew. I thought it was very likely, Caroline said. And I thought it was the most sensible decision available to me, and also the most interesting one. And later I thought I loved him, which was different from sensible but felt like more of it, if that makes sense. James said it didn't entirely make sense. It will, Caroline said. When you're older and you meet someone who makes all the other choices feel like lesser versions of themselves. James considered this with the serious face he used for important things. Okay, he said, and got down from the table, apparently satisfied, and went to find the dog, whose name was now officially Carl because James had named him at age 4, and the name had stuck despite being unusual for a dog. The 1880s moved forward with the gathering pace that decades always have in retrospect. The cattle trade in Caldwell changed, as it was always going to change. The railroad pushing the head of trail further west, the era of the great cattle drives from Texas beginning to wind down as the ranges were fenced and the economics shifted. The Wilcox Ranch adapted, because families that don't adapt don't survive, moving more toward a mixed operation with the horse breeding that Henry and Thomas had developed, and a greater emphasis on quality breeding stock for the cattle rather than volume. Daniel, at 40, finally took a wife of his own, a widow named Margaret Farrow who had a farm 10 miles north of theirs and had been managing it herself with 2 hired men for 3 years since her husband died. She was a strong and quiet woman who matched Daniel in precisely the way that was required to match Daniel, which was by being willing to have long silences and patient conversations, and by having good practical judgment and not requiring things to be made more emotional than they were. They were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, and Margaret moved in, and the house added another dimension of warmth. Andrew watched his older brother discover the thing Andrew had discovered a decade earlier, the warm fire quality of love that is built in ordinary days, and felt a deep and private happiness about it. Thomas, who had been the one to lose the $2 bet to Henry about Andrew's original trip to Caldwell, remained the solitary brother, not from want, but from what appeared to be genuine preference. He had his horses and his skill with animals, and a contentment with the ranch life that needed no supplementing. He was Uncle Thomas to James and Eliza, and the 3 children that Henry and Ruth produced over the years, and he was a very good uncle, patient and imaginative in the way of people who pay close attention to what each person in front of them actually needs. In 1887, Andrew and Caroline had their 3rd child, a boy they named William, called Will from his first day. He came in the winter, which was the bad one, the winter that would later be known as the Great Die-Up across the plains, and his arrival in the middle of all that hardship had a quality of statement about it, of life making its argument against difficulty with all the conviction of a newborn voice. What was different from James and Eliza in the specific way that 3rd children are often different, more adaptable in some ways, more at ease with the world already in his personality, with Andrew's calm and Caroline's humor in roughly equal measure. He followed James everywhere from the time he could walk, and James took this duty as seriously as he took everything else, teaching his little brother with the same patient attention that Andrew had always used with him. The family grew and changed in the ways of families, the way a tree grows, adding rings and branches and height, the central trunk remaining constant, while the shape of the whole thing becomes something larger and more complex with each year's growth. Caroline, at 37 in 1891, was the same person she had been on that hotel staircase, direct and clear and capable, and more, layered with the specific wisdom that comes from having lived hard and well and loved genuinely. She ran the household with the same efficiency she always had, but she had also, over the years, become something more in the ranch's life. Her bookkeeping expanded to cover the full operation, her understanding of the land and its economics deep and applied and real. Andrew, at 41, was settled in himself in the way that men who have done what they were meant to do with the life they were given tend to become. The gray at his temples was recent and seemed to suit him, and he had the particular quality of a person who is exactly where they intended to be, which is a rare and fortunate thing. They had a habit, established years ago and never abandoned, of sitting on the porch in the evening when the day's work was done, in the summer in the last of the light, and in the winter wrapped in blankets with the cold air sharp and clean around them. They talked or they were quiet, as the evening required, and the plain stretched out in front of them, and the sky did what the Kansas sky does, which is to be enormous and present and ever-changing and utterly constant in the way of things that are large enough to contain all their own variations. One such evening in the summer of 1891, with James in his 12th year and Eliza in her 9th and young, Will running around somewhere behind the barn with Carl's son, who was also now named Carl, in an act of memorial naming that James had insisted on, Andrew and Caroline sat in their chairs and watched the last of the sun pull itself down behind the horizon. "You know what I was thinking about today," Caroline said. "Tell me." "I was thinking about Mrs. Hobbs," she said, "at the breakfast place, the morning we met. She kept filling your coffee cup without being asked because she could see the conversation was going well." Andrew smiled. "I noticed that. She was investing in the outcome," Caroline said. "I think she decided in about the first 10 minutes that she approved." "She told me as much," Andrew said, "at the wedding. When she was crying the little bit she didn't want to be caught doing." Caroline laughed. "She came out here to be with me when James was born," she said. "She didn't have to do that. She just wanted to." "People do that," Andrew said, "when they feel like they were there at the beginning of something." Caroline was quiet for a moment. The evening light was doing what it did, the long, golden, horizontal kind that made everything it touched look like something from before, like memory rather than present. She had a coffee cup in her hands, both hands around it, the way she always held it, and she was looking at the horizon with those green eyes that had never once changed in their essential quality of clear and direct attention. "I was terrified that morning," she said, "when Fitch was in my face about my father's debt. I didn't show it because showing it would have been useful to him, but I was." Andrew looked at her. "And then you came across the street," she said, "and the terror went away, not because I needed saving, I didn't, but because someone had come across the street, because it had registered with someone that the situation was unjust. That was the part that mattered, not the assistance, the noticing." "I noticed," Andrew said. "You've always noticed," Caroline said. "That's what I knew that morning. That was the thing that made me say yes. Not the practicality of the situation, not the economics of it, although those were real. But the fact that you came across a muddy street because you had noticed something was wrong and you were calm about it, and you didn't make it a performance. You just fixed it and then asked me to breakfast." Andrew was quiet for a moment. The evening settled around them, the sounds of the ranch going about its evening, the horses in the barn, the dogs somewhere, children's voices, the solid, reliable sounds of a life that had been built piece by piece and was sound all the way through. "I loved you before I knew I loved you," he said. "I think that's what happened that morning. I walked across the street and I loved you before I had any information to base it on, and then every piece of information I got that day confirmed it." Caroline looked at him, and the evening light was on her face, and she was 41 and she was 24 and she was everything in between simultaneously, in the way of people you have known long enough to see all their ages at once. "Nobody was surprised but us," she said. "Henry was the least surprised," Andrew said. "Did he ever tell you what he based it on?" Caroline asked. "That morning when you rode out," Andrew shook his head. "I asked him once. He said it was something about the way I left." Caroline tilted her head. "The way you left?" "He said I rode out like a man who was going to find something," Andrew said. "Not like a man who was going for supplies." Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was right." "He usually is about me," Andrew said. She reached across and took his hand, which she did sometimes in the evenings, not dramatically, just as a thing that seemed natural and right. His hand was large and marked by years of work, and he folded his fingers around hers the way he always did. And they sat on the porch in the summer evening, and the Kansas sky above them was the particular deep blue of the last light before dark, and the first stars were appearing in the east. In the distance, James's voice could be heard issuing instructions about something to Will, who was responding with the cheerful disagreement of a younger brother who knows he will ultimately comply but needs to make his position known first. Eliza's voice joined the conversation, taking neither side but adding a third angle to it, as she always did, which was a thing Andrew recognized as her mother in miniature. "Listen to them," Caroline said softly. Andrew listened. 3 voices, 3 different qualities, 3 different people who were made of him and of Caroline and of something entirely their own. James's measured steadiness, Eliza's pointed intelligence, Will's easy warmth. The best of them in different arrangements. "I went to town for supplies," Andrew said. "Flour, salt, nails, lamp oil." "And me," Caroline said. "And you," he agreed. "In that order." She squeezed his hand once, firm and brief, and they sat and watched the stars come out over the Kansas plains, and the house behind them was full of the sounds of living, and the land stretched wide in every direction, and 13 years had made of that one morning a whole world, complete and sound, and full of everything they had brought to it and grown within it, and given away to the 3 small people arguing cheerfully somewhere behind the barn. Eventually the children came in, Carl's son following at James's heels, and supper was made and eaten, and the table was full of the specific loud overlapping conversation of a family that has opinions and no inhibition about sharing them. Will insisting on a point about horses that Thomas had told him and James disputing it on grounds of having more direct experience, and Eliza telling them both with perfect calm that they were arguing about different things and both were right, which turned out to be accurate and deflated the argument immediately. Caroline caught Andrew's eye across the table, and the look they exchanged was the kind that only people who have been truly together for a long time can manage. A whole paragraph in a single glance, amusement and love and the specific warm fullness of a shared life that is exactly what it was meant to be. After supper and the clearing up and the children to their beds, which involved the usual negotiations and requests for one more thing and the final settling, Andrew and Caroline came back downstairs and the house was quiet and theirs, and she made 2 cups of coffee because evening coffee was one of their constants, and they sat at the kitchen table, which was where the best conversations always seemed to happen. "I want to plant apple trees in the spring," Caroline said. "Along the east side of the kitchen garden. Apple trees take years to produce," Andrew said. "Then we should plant them now," she said. "They'll be ready when the children are older, or their children." Andrew looked at his wife. The lamp was on and her face was lit by it and her green eyes were on the coffee cup, and she was thinking about apple trees that wouldn't bear fruit for years, thinking about the future the way she thought about everything, with the long view and the patient certainty that what you plant now is real even before it grows. "We'll plant them in March," he said. soon as the ground thaws. She looked up and smiled at him, the full smile. They planted the apple trees the following March, 5 of them in a row along the east side of the kitchen garden, and James helped dig the holes with the serious purpose he brought to everything Andrew asked him to do, and Will helped in the more enthusiastic and less precise way of an 8-year-old. And Eliza read to them from a book about fruit trees that she had found in Caroline's collection and reported useful facts about root depth and watering requirements. And Andrew and Caroline planted the trees in the early spring morning, with the smell of fresh-turned earth all around them and the first real warmth of the year in the air. The apple trees grew. Through the 1890s they grew, slowly and steadily, and with the patient inevitability of trees, putting on rings and branches, filling their space, becoming the shade that generations of mornings would happen under. James grew too, into a young man who was recognizably his parents in every way that counted, steady and capable and honest. And in 1897, he married a girl named Ada from a farm 20 miles east, and he brought her home to the ranch in the way that Andrew had brought Caroline home nearly 20 years before, and the family grew another dimension. Eliza went to a teacher's college in Wichita in 1896, because she was exactly that kind of person, and the world of 1896 Kansas was beginning to make room for that kind of person. And she taught school in Caldwell, and then in a growing town further west, and she came home for holidays with the full force of her personality and opinions, and everyone was glad to see her every time. Will stayed on the ranch, which was what the ranch needed, and he was good at it in his own way, with his father's patience and his mother's efficiency and a humor that made the hardest days lighter. And he married a young woman from Caldwell named Sophia in 1898, and there was a granddaughter who arrived the following year, round and loud and perfect, who Caroline held in the morning light in the kitchen of the house where she had lived for 20 years and looked at with the same green eyes that had looked at everything. The supply run morning, the hotel staircase, the Kansas plain, the lamplight rooms, the porch evenings, all the ordinary extraordinary days, and said simply and with all the fullness of 20 years, "Hello, new one, welcome to all of this." Andrew stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his wife holding his granddaughter, and the house was warm, and outside the March morning was beginning to show the first green of the new year, and the apple trees along the east garden were in their 19th year and bearing abundantly, and the land stretched wide and clear in every direction. And everything that had been built from one muddy spring morning and one supply list, and one act of crossing a street because something was wrong and needed to be righted, was present in this moment, solid and true and complete. Henry, who was 50 now and still gap-toothed and still largely right about the important things, came through the back door with his own grandchild on his hip, Ruth's second daughter's first son, and looked at the scene in the kitchen and said, "Now that's a picture." Caroline looked up from the granddaughter. "Did you lose another bet?" she asked. Henry grinned. "I haven't lost a bet worth mentioning in 30 years, he said, "because I only bet on certainties." "You bet on Andrew," Caroline said. "That was the surest thing I ever bet on," Henry said. He looked at Andrew in the doorway. "I told Thomas that morning, look how he's riding out. That's not a man going for flour and salt." "Nobody was surprised," Andrew said. "Nobody was surprised," Henry agreed. Caroline looked down at the new baby in her arms, and the baby looked back at her with the unfocused but attentive gaze of the very new, taking everything in with the full capacity that the newly arrived bring to the world. And Caroline said, quietly, to the baby and to the room and to the 20 years of ordinary perfect days that had filled the house up to this moment, "Good morning. You're going to like it here." And the spring morning moved through the windows of the Wilcox ranch house, and the apple trees caught the light, and the plain was green, and Andrew Wilcox crossed the kitchen the way he had once crossed a muddy street, with the calm, steady purpose of a man who knows where he is going, and he put his arm around his wife and looked at the newest Wilcox, and everything was exactly what it had been building toward from the beginning, complete and warm and sound, with nothing left unfinished and nothing wanting. A life made whole,